Hello and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the Baroque. I can't make any promises. I am a father of three, but I will do my best to avoid any awful dad joke level puns in this lecture. But you gotta realize, I'm a father of three, the temptation is overwhelming. I can make no guarantees. All right, let's move on. So let's talk about the Baroque. What is the Baroque? Well, what does Baroque mean? Well, we don't actually know where the word Baroque comes from. Our best guess is that it's a loan word from Portuguese, Barocco, and that refers to a misshapen pearl. Now, when you think of a pearl, you usually think of a perfect spherical pearl. That's what the preference is for pearls. But the truth is, most pearls are not perfectly spherical. Most pearls are, in fact, kidney-shaped, teardrop-shaped, or strange lumpy shapes like this one, which has been turned into a sea monster so that the god Neptune can ride on it. So what gives? Why did this term for a misshapen or, exaggerated pearl become the term for an entire art movement in the 17th century? Well, sometime in the 16th century, there began to be a change in tastes. And instead of these beautiful spherical pearls, people started to like these misshapen pearls, these lumpy, strange pearls. They thought they were more intriguing, more interesting, and they had this wonderful asymmetric, organic quality. And so it makes sense that this term for a kind of misshapen, lumpy pearl becomes applied to the art movement for the entire era, because it also indicates that there was a change in taste. The artwork is more theatrical, more melodramatic. It's often going to be asymmetrical or bizarre. It's going to have an exaggerated appearance. And so this pearl becomes the perfect loan word to describe the more exaggerated style of the 17th century. Now, there are no hard and fast dates on the Baroque. Certainly by the time we hit the 17th century, 1600s, we're definitely into it. We start to get out of it towards the end of the 17th century, but it might even start around 1590, a decade before. The one thing we can say about the Baroque is that it starts in Italy. Italy is the birthplace of the Baroque. It starts in the southern countries and then goes north. So next week we'll talk about the golden age of Dutch painting, and we'll talk about the French Baroque, which is, again, different, like everything the French do. But today we're going to start with Italy. There's probably no artist that better typifies the Baroque than this character right here, Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Gian Lorenzo Bernini is a fascinating character because he's something of a child prodigy, that by the time he's in his teenage years, he's already sculpting on the level of a master, and he comes to the attention of the Borghese family. Now, the Borghese family is going to be a very important family because in the 17th century, you're essentially going to have two families trading off control of the papacy, the Borghese and the Barberini families. And these popes are the popes that are going to make the character of what we understand Rome today. It's funny, we think of Rome as a Renaissance city, but the truth is it's actually a Baroque city. That all those great avenues, all those great plazas, most of those were built actually in the 17th century under the Borghese and Barberini popes. And they basically give Bernini carte blanche to do whatever he wants with the city, and they fund his endeavors. So you can't go around Rome today without seeing something that isn't touched by the hand of Bernini. He did St. Peter's Square. He's got fountains, the Fountain of the Triton. He's got an obelisk's base in front of the Pantheon. Good gravy, the Piazza Navona. He's retouched much of the city. And in fact, he earns this title. He's actually given a formal title, the renewer or the beautifier of the city. And so rarely is a massive workshop with hundreds of assistants. But he starts out his career just as a sculptor. He comes to the attention of Cardinal Borghese, and Cardinal Borghese commissions him to do a series of sculptures, and they're really just astounding. So in his early 20s, he does a series of about 5 different sculptures. Some are classically themed, some are religiously themed. We're going to take a look at a few of them here. Right off the bat, you can tell Bernini is somebody special. So Bernini brings 2 talents to sculpting marble. The first is just raw technical ability. And you can see that in this work. Again, I have to remind you, this is marble. The story is the story of Apollo and Daphne. Daphne is this nymph. Apollo, the Greek god, sees her, desires her, and attempts to rape her. But she flees to the river and calls out to her father, the river god, and says, "Save me, Dad." And Dad saves her by turning her into a tree. Gee, thanks, Dad. Although there have been times I've wanted to turn my daughters into trees when I've seen their boyfriends. But what you see here then is Apollo racing up, and I love how his hand doesn't actually touch her. His hand actually reaches around to touch her, but the bark grows up around her feet to prevent that. And then when you look at her hair and her fingers over here, you can see how they are turning into the branches of a laurel tree. Now, first of all, this is marble, people. Marble is hard, marble is brittle. It's incredibly hard to carve this way. And so this is a level of technical mastery that no one had ever seen before. So Apollo grabs the tree, and according to Ovid, he says, "Well, you may not be my nymph, but you will always be my tree." And the Daphne is the Greek word for the laurel tree. And so if you've ever wondered why do we talk about somebody getting their laurels or somebody getting a crown of laurels for victory or an artistic achievement, that's what we mean by it, because Apollo is the god of arts and sciences, and so when you get these achievements, you get your laurels, because the tree is sacred to him, because he couldn't date rape this nymph. Boy, that got really dark soon. Okay, but moving on. The second thing that Gian Lorenzo Bernini brings to it is his compositional skill. So not only does he have this incredible technical skill to carve marble into these thin and delicate branches and drapery, he has this incredible compositional skill where there really isn't a single way to look at this statue. No matter how you look at it, if you look at it from the front, or if you look at it from the side or the back, it produces a compelling viewpoint. You have this wide, sweeping drapery, the hands thrown up, the hair flowing back. It has this wonderful twisting motion that's kind of satisfying any way that you look at it. It's not meant to just kind of stand there and be appreciated from one point of view. You have to walk around it to get even a full sense of how complex this piece is. That's a major feature of the Baroque, is that it doesn't give you one ideal view. It forces you to consider many different views. He did a lot of these sculptures for the Borghese family. This one is, of course, the rape of Persephone by Hades. Here you can see Hades. Again, rape and abduction stories are common in Greek mythology. What can you say? And here you have Hades lifting Proserpina or Persephone up off the ground. And again, they have this wonderful twisting motion that requires you to look around the figures to see them all. And when you view this in black and white, you really get a sense of his technical mastery, that the hands and the fingers of Hades here presses into the flesh, the thigh and abdomen of Persephone, and it almost looks real. It's just incomparable, the veins, the quality of the flesh, etc. So this combination of compositional skill and technical skill really do make these amazing. One of my favorites from this series is a Judeo-Christian themed, which is the scene of David. Now again, in this one, we have a very, very compelling twisting figure. His body has all this torsion in it. You can see David, he is standing over the armor that he rejected, and instead is going up against Goliath alone with just his sling. His whole body is twisted up, and even when you look at his face, his brow is furrowed. He's biting his bottom lip. You can see all this intensity present. Now, this is a good place to really explain why the Baroque is so different by comparing this to its Renaissance counterpart. So, over here on the left, we have Bernini's David, and over here on the right, we have Michelangelo's David. And you can see how different they really are. First off, the things that they're similar in. They both have this emphasis on anatomy, on classical proportion. So we still have this high degree of naturalism, this high degree of classicism, but that's about where the comparisons end. Everything else about this is different. Let's start with Michelangelo's David on the right. When you look at Michelangelo's David on the right, other than the sling, which you can barely see across his shoulder, there's almost nothing here to indicate that this is in fact David. There's nothing narratively here to link this to the story of David from the Bible. Whereas over here, we have the discarded armor, the armor that Saul offered him that he refused to wear. You also have a harp, because David is known as a musician. And then the sling, rather than being kind of hidden, as in Mike's version, over here in Bernini's version, is very clearly present. The other thing that's present is the sense of time. If you look at Michelangelo's David, you have to ask the question, when is this in the story of David and Goliath? Is he about to shoot at Goliath? Is he thinking about shooting at Goliath? Has he already shot at Goliath and is just sitting there posing? You don't know. There's a timelessness to this figure. Again, this one, while you can walk around Michelangelo's David, it's mostly meant to be seen from the front. It has one preferred view, and it's very calm, it's very staid, and it is, in fact, timeless. It could be just before the moment of the battle, or it could be just after. There's really no way to know. His face does have a bit of a furrowed brow, but, you know, there's not much there. I gave him angry eyes here. Let's give him even angrier eyes. And those long, ridiculous eyebrows for some reason, which we decided elves and creatures in World of Warcraft have. And now I want to give him those long, ridiculous, pointy ears. Okay, our art historian has lost his mind. Let's erase all that. So you look at his face, and while there is some intensity, there's nothing here that gives you that clear sense of time. But now look at Bernini's David. Bernini's David is in the wind-up. He is definitely about to fire a shot. This is right before he takes Goliath down. So it gives you this sense of immediacy, this sense of import, of that the time is critical. One of the ways that people describe it is that the energy in Renaissance art is all potential. It's very much like that classical model. If you know early classical sculpture from the ancient Greeks, then you know that they showed the body just as it was about to unleash movement. They were trying to capture that moment of stillness that exists just before an athlete throws a discus or throws a javelin. And so all of this is potential energy. It isn't yet in motion, but it could at any moment. Whereas this guy is not potential energy. He is moving. He is absolutely moving. It's kinetic energy over here. It's dramatic. It's dynamic. It's in the moment. It's not timeless. And so it's much more emotional, it's much more visceral in that regard. And this is what really separates the Baroque from the classical. Baroque is in the moment, dramatic, dynamic, kinetic energy, as opposed to timeless, calm, has one preferred viewpoint, as in the Renaissance. My favorite description of this is that an art historian was describing this, and he said that Michelangelo's David invites us to stand there and admire him contemplatively, whereas when we look at Bernini's David, we are inspired to get out of the line of fire because we feel the energy, the intensity. That's what the Baroque is and why it's so different from what came before. So this cements Bernini's reputation and gets him a lot of really incredible commissions. And from this time, he just goes from strength to strength to strength until he has this massive workshop where he's reworking many of the monuments in and around Rome. And you can see what he does with this. He gets this commission for the Cornaro Chapel. The Cornaro Chapel is a chapel attached to Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, and it is, again, another one of these wealthy patrons. They want a private chapel off of the main church. So you can see how the chapel just sticks off the aisle of the main church. And he, instead of giving them just a kind of generic thing, he gives them this theatrical, installation. Now, I want to point out that everything here is done by Bernini. We often just concentrate on the statue in the center, but all of this was done by Bernini, and it is a kind of theatrical stage. First off, let's look to the center. So in the very center, we have a scene of the ecstasy of St. Teresa. St. Teresa was one of these 16th century counter-Reformation saints that had a series of visions, and she was very quickly elevated to sainthood, and she became a patron saint of the Cornaro family, which is why they wish to have this chapel dedicated to her. So everything is focused in around this scene. Let's take a look at the architecture. First of all, you have polychromy. You have a wide variety of marbles, giallo antico, serpentine, white marble, all these different marbles creating this very variegated scene. It's not just all plain white marble. I think the most fascinating thing, though, is this broken pediment. So a pediment is this triangular section above a kind of architectural framework, but this thing is broken in that it has a break. It jogs out before it comes to the point. And not only does it break, it curves, so that it curves out, and then it curves back, and then it curves out again, creating this push and pull. That's another major feature of the Baroque. It has this very strong sense of push and pull. It's not just going to produce a flat facade. It's going to have a variegated facade that has deep recesses and promontories that stick out. It challenges you. It comes into your space. All of this is framework for the central scene. And we come to the central scene, and the central scene shows this ecstasy of St. Teresa. St. Teresa is carved here, floating on a cloud. And I love that this cloud's base is mostly concealed and in a darker color, so you can't see it. So it really looks like her cloud is floating here. The cloud is carved out of stone, but here has this quality of lightness. I also love her drapery. All of her drapery, it doesn't look like it's drapery hanging on the body. It defies gravity. It's almost like she's underwater and it's floating. Everything is in motion. The same thing here with the angel. The angel's drapery is much lighter and is billowing as if in an invisible breeze, but it seems to be billowing slowly. Now what's happening here in the story is, according to the legend, St. Teresa has this vision. She goes into heaven, and in heaven an angel lifts up her robe and pierces her heart with an arrow, and the arrow, of course, represents the love of God. That the love of God is this kind of ecstatic experience, like being pierced with an arrow. And you can see that her mouth is open, her head is tilted back in ecstasy. And the angel has somewhat of a creepy expression on his face for a guy who's about to impale this woman. But again, this is all meant to be spiritual. So it gives you this strange kind of experience. This is a visionary experience. Remember what we said about the Counter-Reformation, that after the Council of Trent, Catholics said, well, okay, some of these reforms that the Protestants are suggesting we can be down with. But some of them are a little bit too far, and they want to get rid of images. But images are the way we communicate the Spirit. And they also want to get away from the cult and the worship of saints. And we say, no, we like the devotion of saints because this shows that the Spirit of God is with us. And so this is, again, a reaffirmation of that. And by showing this, the artist is trying to give you something of the same sense of the visionary experience that St. Teresa would have experienced. One of my favorite details of this is that there is no obvious light source. You have to remember that in the 17th century, there's no artificial lighting, there's no electricity. So if you want to light something, you got to do it with sunlight or candles or oil lamps. That's what your choices are. So if we were doing this today and we wanted dramatic lighting, we just dump a 10,000 lumen LED in front top of it, and boy, it would be lit up. It would be lit up like a nuclear dawn. But you can't do that in the 17th century. So he has to create the lighting some other way. And if you'll notice, the lighting comes straight down as if from heaven. And the light reflects off these bronze rods, and these bronze rods are covered in gilding and gold, so they reflect the light. So they look like the light coming down from heaven. But where is that light coming from? There's no obvious light source up here, and you as a viewer looking up into it wouldn't see it. You actually have to almost get right up underneath it, and you can see that there's a window up there. That the window's light source has been more or less concealed, so that the light itself is kind of mystical. You can't sense where the light is. And that's kind of a spiritual message. The idea that the light is coming from God. It's not coming from any earthly source. It's coming from God. So he's created this kind of mystic experience of seeing this light to give you the sense of what it must be like to see the spiritual light. There's a very famous architectural historian by the name of Richard Krautheimer, and he often talked in terms of Protestant light and Catholic light, which is a brilliant way of conceiving it. If you go into a Protestant church, your typical Protestant church has light illuminating everything. It has lots of white, clear windows, not much stained glass, and you have uniform light. And that's because the Protestants valued this kind of idea of transparency and openness, that you can take the scriptures in your own hand and you can read them. And so it's a very open, uniform, global light. But if you go into a Catholic church, you won't see that. Instead, what you will see is that the light is focused all on the altar. There's stained glass windows that give a dappled light effect. The light directs your eye to the important parts of the shrine or the sanctuary, or the parts where the miracles are supposed to take place. And by miracles, I mean the miracle of the Eucharist and of the communion, transubstantiating into the body and the blood of Christ, as Catholics believe. And so to them, we want to use light in a dramatic way to illuminate what we say are the spiritual messages of this. So instead of this uniform light, you have very focused light. You have direct theatrical light that focus your attention on the spiritual things. And you go through this journey. As you process down to the altar, you move from a darker church into the light, and you have this mystical journey. So it's a very different concept of how light is conceived of in architectural spaces, and you can see it clearly here, how he orchestrates this to bring you to this spiritual message and this vision of Saint Teresa. But it's not just Saint Teresa that's having this experience. You're having this experience, and not only that, but you have the Cornaro family. That in the sides of the chapel, he has members of the Cornaro family here in balconies. And again, all of this is stone. This drapery here is carved out of stone. And on one side, you see them looking at the vision. They themselves are experiencing this vision, and they're debating about it. On the other side is another balcony where they sit and read their scriptures and debate about what this means and what it means about the love of God. And you are part of this dialogue as you are included in this. So everything about this chapel is there to give you some sense of the same mystical experience that Saint Teresa herself would have experienced. Well, from achievements like this, Bernini gets some of the largest commissions you can possibly have. And one of his most prominent ones is here in the Piazza Navona. Now, the Piazza Navona is located in the Campus Martius. This is this region of Rome. So here we are looking at Rome. And it actually was the stadium of Domitian, this Roman emperor. But over the course of the Middle Ages, it got turned into a public square. You have an open space where they used to have competitions and sports and spectacles for Romans, but over the course of the Middle Ages, it gets turned into kind of an open square. And it's still there. It's a great place, fun place to hang out. So Bernini is commissioned to redo the square. Up until the time of Bernini, it had mostly just been an open dirt area. It hadn't been paved. So they want it paved, but they also want fountains added so that it can be this nice public place. There was an obelisk in the center of the old stadium. The obelisk was actually an Egyptian obelisk that had been brought there by the Romans, by Domitian, and set up. But the obelisk was in a bad state of repair, and Bernini decides, well, let's make this the centerpiece of the new space. And so while the obelisk had existed there before and had been brought to this location anciently from Egypt by the Romans, this lower section here and the fountain around it, and the fountains at both ends, was constructed and made by Bernini and his workshop. So here is the obelisk base, and the obelisk base is this wonderful object that again is carved from travertine and marble. Travertine is this, everybody knows what travertine is. It used to be that, man, I'm so old in art history that, 20 years ago when I said travertine, I had to explain what travertine was. It's this kind of variegated, beautiful marble, but now everybody knows what it is because you can buy it at Home Depot and clad your bathroom in it. Someday I hope to have a bathroom clad in it. But anyhow, so it's made out of travertine. And the subject of it is the four rivers. So there are four great rivers that are this was this idea that existed at the time, that there were four great rivers of the world. There was the Yellow River in Asia, there was the Danube in Europe, and then you also have the Nile in Africa, etc. So these are kind of like the four great rivers of the world, and it's a concept like the four corners of the world. It represents the full grand scope of the world. And of course, at this time in the 17th century, this is when the church and European culture is spreading out over the world. So there's a touch of imperialism, touch of kind of colonialism in this idea of incorporating all the four rivers into a fountain. It shows the breadth and the spread of European culture and of the Catholic Church, so that makes sense. So you have this wonderful kind of grotto. It's an artificial grotto that is constructed. You have these seahorses gambling about in it, and then the four figures are the four rivers themselves, and then fountains spew from them. And they are depicted like river gods, and in typical Roman fashion, river gods are usually guys that have big shaggy beards and lots of muscles, and they're usually seen with oars. So here you can see a river god. This is a river god, I think from the Danube, and so he represents the rivers of Europe. There are some details here that are really kind of fun and intriguing. Over here you have the papal crest. So this is the papal crown with the keys of St. Peter's. So this is funded by the Pope. So he's got to get his crest in there as well. You'll notice this guy has his head covered. Now the reason for that is that most of these rivers, we knew where the headwaters of these rivers were. But the headwaters of the Nile had not been discovered until they were discovered by Richard Burton. Richard Burton, the explorer, not Richard Burton, the actor who married Elizabeth Taylor. But Richard Burton in the 19th century is this British explorer who eventually discovers the headwaters of the Nile. But at the time in the 17th century, nobody knew where the Nile started. It was so long, it went deep into Africa and nobody knew. And so since we didn't at the time know where the headwaters of the Nile was, he decided to cover it with a covering. It's just kind of funny. Now, so it's a kind of a visual pun, if you will. See, Bernini can get away with dad humor. I can't get away with dad jokes, but Bernini can do it. When you're Bernini, you can do anything. So here's Bernini doing this fun visual pun. The other feature of this that's often described as a gag is an urban legend. It isn't true, but it's such a great urban legend. I'll have to share it anyway. So the story that's commonly told by tour guides if you go here is that this figure here is holding his hand up in disgust and horror, and he happens to be looking at the facade of San Agnese. San Agnese was actually a building that was done by Bernini's chief rival, Borromini. Here you can get a view of it here. And so the argument here is that Bernini was playing a subtle joke. You may remember that we talked about Cellini. Cellini made this wonderful visual gag where he had his statue of Perseus and Medusa holding up the head of the Gorgon as if it were turning Michelangelo's statue into stone. And so people have argued that, oh, that's what he's doing here, is he's having this guy react in horror to the ugly facade of his rival. Alas, that story cannot be true, because the fountain was built first and the facade was built later. So it doesn't work. Oh, but it would be great if it did. So, hey, if you ever design a papal fountain for an old abandoned Roman stadium, make sure you throw some shade on your rivals. I mean, that would be good. Okay, so the other great commission that he builds, of course, is Piazza San Pietro. This is the big square, St. Peter's Square, that's out in front of the new building of St. Peter's at the Vatican. So the Vatican is located out here across the Tiber. And so here we have the original building, which was originally conceived by Bramante, but finished out and redesigned by Michelangelo. Now, Michelangelo had originally intended this as a Greek cross, which meant that it had 4 arms that were equal length, but then eventually they decided to extend one side, so you have now a Latin cross church. and then a new facade was placed on it. So Bernini's challenge was to take what was, quite frankly, an open dirt field at the time, this area here, and redesign it. So here you have the facade, and the facade was designed by another architect, Moderno, and it was designed to have bell towers which were never finished. There are bells in these lower sections, but it was quite wide. And Bernini conceived of this as a kind of problem. So he designed this square to narrow in the space, to give it more focus. Remember that St. Peter's was also built just to one side of the Circus of Nero, and the Circus of Nero also had an obelisk, but this obelisk was located over here. So the obelisk was transported to the center of the square. And then Bernini designed this amazing square around it. Here is the square looking at it from the other direction. Now again, the problem is this facade. The facade was regarded as too wide. It extended beyond the church, and it fundamentally changed the kind of proportions of the approach to the church, making it hard to see the dome beyond. So Bernini came up with a very interesting idea. He created a forecourt, and in this forecourt he created a trapezoidal space that actually narrowed the view of the facade, almost trimming off those bell towers so that all you could see was that center section. And then he put two exedra, two sweeping colonnades. And those colonnades were based on not a circle, but an ellipse. And the concept of this was that these were like the arms of the church reaching out to embrace everyone. And you can see he actually made a drawing like that. You know, here he is showing this guy with his strange arms. But the idea that this square would embrace everyone who came into it. And it's actually a genius design. When the Pope would come out and give his public speeches, he would often come to a balcony on the front of St. Peter's, or when he would go to view crowds, he would actually come to his apartment, which is right up here. So either way, people could stand in the square and see the Pope. But the Pope was protected. He was insulated from, the mobs, in case mobs getting a little bit unruly. But at the same time, they felt enclosed. The other thing that's genius is because this is a colonnade, you can approach it from every direction. Originally, it was supposed to have this kind of entrance section here. They never finished that. And as you can see, when it was kind of finished out in the days of Mussolini, he kind of created another little court out here. But he followed the kind of trapezoidal shape of Bernini's forecourt. So it kind of works, not too bad. The net effect of this is that it creates an amazing space where you can gather large numbers of crowds, but then the crowds can freely disperse. That, when you stand in this crowd, you feel like you're part of the crowd. You feel like you're in this space. But then the second the crowd needs to be dismissed, you can just pass through the columns and out in many different directions. So it's really, in addition to being lovely and beautiful, it's an excellent form of crowd management because it gives you a sense of being together in one space, but then people can easily disperse through it. That's kind of been counteracted today by modern security needs. Since the days of 9/11, most of these columns have barriers back here, so you can't just walk freely. But you can see how this would allow you to see through to the other side. It allows the movement of air and originally allowed the movement of people. You can see the Pope at his balcony, or you can see him up in his, kind of little apartment and feel very much part of this space. Now, I happened to be there in 2005 when Pope John Paul II fell ill, and they had a vigil for many days. And so I really can tell you that it really has this amazing experience to be in this space. I was in this space, I stayed there till 2 a.m., and there were people from all over the world, thousands of them gathering in this space. And it did have this comforting sense of being in a space all together, but then allowing it to be a kind of open space. It works very much as a gathering space, as an audience space, but also as a kind of space for framing the building. It's really expertly done. Bernini would go on to do many, many features at St. Peter's. You can walk through St. Peter's and there are just statues everywhere by him. One of the more important ones is this one by Bernini. This is Longinus. Longinus is the Roman centurion who pierced the side of Christ as his crucifixion. And the spear that pierced the side of Christ is one of the relics that's contained in the Vatican. And so this is a statue dedicated to him. And so he sits in one of the niches of one of the four main piers of the crossing of the church. And we can see he has the same kind of ecstatic flair. He is there at the moment where he recognizes, this is supposedly the person said that, when Christ died on the cross and there was this rumbling of the earth and the skies went dark, and according to Christian tradition, the centurion said, truly this was, a righteous man. And you can see him with his hands extended. His face has this wild hair. His eyes actually gaze towards the altar to make that connection as well. And then his drapery around him has all of these wild folds. He was also commissioned to do the tomb of Pope Alexander VII. And again, you have the individual representation of the Pope himself, the entrance into his tomb, and we have figures representing the world of time seated under all of this incredible drapery. And what I love is climbing out from under this drapery as a representation of death. And it's so funny because death is represented by a skeleton, and the fact that he's being covered by the drapery in this dramatic fashion is indication that ultimately death has no triumph in the Christian tradition, that the resurrection will overcome death. So death's face is obscured, but it's like death, he can't be ignored, so he shoves the hourglass up there to say, hey, you can't ignore me, you can't ignore death, but ultimately death will be conquered. Probably the most famous of all of these constructions of Bernini inside St. Peter's is the baldacchino. So a baldacchino or a baldachin is a canopy that sits over the altar. In early Christian times, this was often a temporary canopy that would be done for the Mass or the liturgy. Remember, St. Peter's, old St. Peter's was this great church from the time of Constantine. But in the 16th century, they start tearing it down to replace it with the much larger church that's currently there. So this is new St. Peter's. But in old St. Peter's, there was a baldachin. Over the tomb of Peter, which had a shrine right there, there was a kind of canopy. And that canopy was supported on columns that we call Solomonic columns. A Solomonic column is a twisted column. Solomonic columns were very popular in the late antique period at the time of Constantine and early Christianity. And these twisted columns are actually still there in the church. In fact, you can see some of them. These are some of the original twisted columns from the original baldachin. And so when they decided to redo the baldachin for St. Peter's, Bernini decided to mimic those Solomonic columns, except he just did it on a much grander scale because the church was so much larger. Remember, the old church could fit neatly inside this church. They didn't tear the old church down until they built the new church over it. That's how much bigger New St. Peter's is. But it's functionally the same. It's conceptually the same. It has the Solomonic columns that support a canopy. And you can see that when we look at some of the details, it's even still imagined as if it were a cloth canopy. You have these things here that dangle down as if this is a cloth spread over the top. We then have little angels. You have baby angels here supporting the papal crown and holding the papal keys. These are emblems of the Pope. And then we have angels standing on all four corners. You really can't appreciate the scale of this thing and how monumental it is unless you see it next to actual people. It's more than 60 feet high up there in the air. And so to get a sense of how big those angels are, the best thing to do is to see it when someone is cleaning it. They dust it twice a year, just before Easter and Christmas, which are the biggest Christian holidays. So that makes sense. And just look at how teeny the cleaners are compared to these monumental bronze statues. I think it's even a little better when you see the baby angels, these cherubs, compared to these guys. They're just absolutely dwarfed. The entire thing is covered in wonderful, rich detail. As you look at the baldachin, you'll notice that its too is covered by laurels. The laurels themselves, in many cases, the laurels were actually taken from real trees so that the casting would be accurate. You also have little putti, little baby angels dancing about. You'll also notice there's a large number of bees. Bees are the emblems of the Borromini family, and there's actually molded into the step the crest of the Pope himself, a little medallion of the Pope to kind of build in that, this was built during his time period. So it satisfies on so many levels. It's not just grandiose and large in its sense, but every little detail builds up this kind of story. And of course, in the center of the canopy, we have the dove representing the Holy Spirit. At the top, we have the orb representing the world, surmounted by the cross, representing the dominion of Christianity. Really just incredible. And there was one last major installation that he did at St. Peter's, and that is the throne of Peter himself. So you may wonder, why is a cathedral called a cathedral? A cathedral is called a cathedral. We just think of cathedral as a big church, but that's not. A cathedral is the church where the bishop has his seat, his bishop's throne. And so a cathedral is named for a cathedra. A cathedra is the throne from which the bishop rules. And one of the holiest relics in Christianity is the seat of Peter, the throne of Peter. And so this thing was almost constructed as a gigantic reliquary. So this bronze chair here originally was intended to contain the original chair of Peter inside. Ironically, St. Peter's is not the Cathedral of Rome. It is the central church of the Vatican, but the place where the Bishop of Rome, which is the Pope, that's who he is, he's the Bishop of Rome, the place where the Bishop of Rome has his throne is actually in St. John Lateran's. But, minor religious, trivia there. So we have this throne representing the authority of Peter seated there, and we have all angel gazing down on it. Supporting the throne are bishops on all sides. And then, of course, again, we have this wonderful bronze cloud covered in gilding. As we look over the throne is blessed again by the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit here is surrounded by a whole choir of angels. Angels that are baby angels, cherubs, but also higher orders of angels. And they surround a stained glass window, which again has a representation of the dove, the Holy Spirit. So you have this sense of, again, light that, it brings you to this location. And then you have his bronze rods again, which demonstrate the radiating light. All this to catch the light and to create this kind of mystical experience. You really can't appreciate the scale of these things until you notice just how small the people are. Really incredible. Well, towards the end of his life, Bernini was actually loaned out by the Pope to the King of France. So he does make a trip to France. Now again, remember, in the system of patronage, you go where your patron tells you to go. You are kind of his indentured servant, and you really don't have a choice of whether you do what he says or not. You pretty much are stuck. He pays the bills, so you have to go. France had always had a very special relationship with the papacy. One of the titles of France and the Kingdom of France was the first daughter of the church, because France had always been a very strong supporter of the papacy. What's interesting is that for a time there, the papacy actually moves to Avignon, and that's what Italians call the Babylonian captivity, this period where the papacy isn't in Italy, it's in France, but then you also have anti-popes and two popes at the same time, and discussions about who the real pope is. But eventually, by the 17th century, all of that is resolved. It happened in the Middle Ages, so By this time, it's all resolved, but the Pope still has this very strong connection to the King of France. And one of the most important kings that lived at this time is Louis XIV. We will come back to him when we talk about French Baroque next week. But for now, just be aware that Bernini, who is this kind of pioneer of this Baroque style in sculpture and architecture, is sent to France and is commissioned to do sculptures. And what's interesting is the French, they don't like him. They consider this just too much. This is a portrait that he did for Louis XIV. You can put this wonderfully deeply drilled flowing hair, and you just have to love this wonderful movement of drapery. But for the French, this was just too much. It was too dramatic. The French still had a little bit more classical reserve. They didn't like this push and pull. One of the things that Bernini was commissioned to do was to redesign the Louvre. The Louvre was the royal palace at the time. We know it as a museum today, but it was a royal palace in Paris at the time. And he designed a facade that looked like this. And wow, what a facade it was. You can see that it shows off his love for this push and pull, this curvilinear facade that curves away from us, then breaks forward, and then curves again. The French didn't much like this. They thought this was just a bit too much. So he gave a second shot at it, and this, he actually put a kind of round, almost like temple in the center of it, so it curves away, curves towards you, and then curves back again. Ultimately, the French rejected all of this, and they went for a style that had some of that push and pull, and they settled on an architect, Charles Perrault, who gave them this, and this is the modern Eastern facade of the Louvre today. You can see that it has some of that. It has a kind of center pediment. It has doubled up columns and a colonnade, so there's a little bit push and pull, but it's far more reserved than what the Italians were doing. And that's something that's going to separate the French Baroque, is the French Baroque is going to be a bit more reserved. It's still theatrical, still has this kind of stage-like presence, but not to the degree that the Italian Baroque is going to do. Now, outside of Bernini, there were other sculptors and architects who were doing really fascinating stuff, who were trying to get this sense of immediacy, but were doing it in a different way. One of my favorites is this by Maderno. Maderno was a sculptor, and he was commissioned to create a sculpture of Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia had a church in the Trastevere region of Rome, which is the section across the Tiber River from the main section of Rome. And Saint Cecilia is an early Christian saint. She is martyred. She is martyred by a variety of horrific ways. She is boiled in oil but miraculously survives, and eventually they end up slitting her throat or nearly cutting her head off. Her body was buried and a church was built over the top of it, but the church was redone in the 17th century, and so her tomb had to be opened. And one of the things that's really interesting is when her tomb is reopened, the artist, Maderno, was actually there on the scene. They brought him in to see this. And when they opened up her tomb, this is what they saw. They saw a scene of a woman that had been miraculously preserved. In the Catholic tradition, this is the standard evidence that a person is a saint, that their body has not decayed. And so they opened up the tomb, looked in, and they saw this figure of a woman. And you can see the slash mark on her throat. You can actually even see a little bit of the gore dripping down. Her head is turned almost 180 degrees. It's terrible fashion. And then her hands were in this interesting gesture, which of course they interpreted as a kind of sign of the Trinity. So Maderno is given this amazing commission. They reinter the body of Saint Cecilia, and they say, but we want people to know what it was like to open up this tomb and feel the experience of seeing her miraculously preserved body. So he creates this sculpture. So this is a sculptural reproduction of what it was like to look into the tomb. And it is at once kind of discomforting, but it's also really compelling. When you go there, it's quite amazing because you kind of go up to the sanctuary. You almost can't see the statue till you go up to the sanctuary and go down. It gives you the sensation of looking into a grave or into a tomb. and feeling this experience. Again, it's the sense of immediacy. It's as if you are there when the tomb was opened and you experience the body in the same way that Maderno and the other individuals who disinterred the saint's body. It gives you something, a way of feeling closer to this mystical experience. Well, in architecture, the chief rival to Bernini is Borromini. And Francesco Borromini was an architect. Unlike Bernini, he didn't do a lot of sculpture. And he was active mostly in Rome. One of his major monuments is this one right here, San Carlo al Quattro Fontane, or St. Charles of the Four Fountains. And it's just an amazing structure, built into the urban fabric. But it gives you this sense of how dramatic the Baroque had become. Again, the upper facade curves away in a broken pediment, but the lower facade is just out of this world. It comes towards you, curves away, curves back towards you, and then curves away before it breaks off again. When you get into this building, instead of stepping into a rectangular or orthogonal shape, you are met with this oval-shaped structure that has an oval dome, a shallow oval dome over the entire structure. And then it has these apses. I mean, look at the floor plan of this thing, how wild this is. This is a courtyard out here. I mean, look how this strange, random, polygonal courtyard is. But this oval doesn't really give you any place to rest your eyes. As you look at the architrave goes straight, then curves around, goes straight again. Looking up into the dome, you have this shallow dome. Now, this dome looks like it recedes off into infinity because you have these crosses and octagons, and it feels like it stretches up. It's actually a very shallow dome. What they've done is they've made the crosses and the octagons appear smaller, so there's a kind of sense of forced perspective. But you look up into that, and then there's a lantern, a kind of cupola at the top. It has an emblem of the Holy Spirit. So again, it has this kind of Catholic light. The light only comes in from certain spaces and illuminates it that way. It's a really dramatic and interesting space. As crazy as that is, it's not even as crazy as St. Ivo's. So St. Ivo's is, again, built into this hospital, and it becomes the church for the hospital. As you look at it, it's built into the courtyard. The facade curves away from you dramatically, but the upper part of the facade curves towards you dramatically. As you look to the very top, oh my gosh, this thing is like the craziest, most Victorian wedding cake you've ever seen. We have doubled up columns, scalloped architraves, but the top is an actual spiral. It sits there and spirals up until you get to the top. How ecstatic can that be? When you get to the interior isn't a square, it isn't a rectangle or anything that you might recognize. It's instead this lobed triangular figure. It's like a trefoil figure. It has 3 lobes intersected with a triangle, and when you open this and get inside, you can see how the moldings bend all the way around it, creating this just incredibly dynamic space. Baroque architecture doesn't give you a place to rest your eyes. It forces you. Your eyes have to travel all of the cornices and moldings and surfaces. Again, it becomes a theatrical space. Really amazing. Included are these little heads of putti or seraphim that are up here. Again, light coming in mostly from the lantern at the top. We do have the Montes. These are mountains. This is part of the crest of the Borghese family and of the Pope at the time. So really just incredible, undulating, organic surfaces that seem to defy, normal architecture. Fun stuff. When we go to painting in the Baroque is kind of an extension, at least in the beginning, of the Renaissance, and moves into that manneristic phase, but again becomes more muscular. I think mannerism moves away from classicism. The Baroque moves towards the classicism, but it's going to be a classicism that's informed by more theatrical content. The first great family of Baroque painters are going to be the Carracci family. And so towards the end of the 16th century, the beginning of the 17th century, you're going to have these family of painters, the Carraccis. And probably the most important is going to be Annibale. Annibale Carracci creates these wonderful commissions. He gets this commission to do the Farnese Palace, and what we're looking at are these paintings that you see up here on the ceiling. And you can see that we have a series of paintings. The subjects are all going to be classical, so this is very humanist, very much a revival of this classical tradition. But each of the paintings is conceived more or less as an individual panel painting telling a particular classical story. Between those paintings we have these Atlas or Telamone figures. This is just paint, nothing here is sculpted, but these are conceived as sculptures supporting the roof and supporting the features of the painting. So this is all fresco. In the center, we have a scene known as the Triumph of Bacchus. Okay, Bacchus is one of the younger gods, but the Triumph of Bacchus, Bacchus becomes, of course, is this god of wine. He's analogous to Dionysus in the Greek. But he's a god of visions as well. But according to a lot of traditions, he eventually has this triumph. He returns from India, has this incredible triumph, and is elevated to the status of an Olympian god. Over here we have Silenus, which is a god of drunkenness. Yes, in Greek mythology you have a god of wine and a god of drunkenness. They're two separate gods. And here he is with his goddess, his partner Ariadne, who is being crowned, and he is being pulled in a chariot by tigers. So some of these rap stars think they have bling. Well, come talk to me when you're being pulled in a golden chariot by tigers. I guess I shouldn't say that. I would give good gravy. I could give Kanye ideas. Anyhow, he would do it. But when you look at this scene, one of the things that's notable about it is the dynamic action. It's all, again, movement. You have lively figures, diagonal compositions, figures dancing about, movement. It doesn't give your place an eye to rest. That isn't to say that Carracci couldn't do that. I mean, he did. We have these wonderful landscapes that are interpreted as, again, biblical scenes. Here is the flight into Egypt, where we have Joseph, the donkey, and Mary and Christ child fleeing into Egypt, but most of the scene is given over to this kind of classical landscape. But still it has this richness, this surface and tactile richness. You can see all the leaves and the features, etc. So even though it isn't this, busy party of the Triumph of Bacchus, it still, betrays some of that kind of Baroque intensity. The person who's most responsible for creating this kind of style of high Baroque painting, who emulates and he picks up where Carracci left off and takes off and goes from there, is going to be Cortona. Pietro da Cortona becomes a painter to the popes. He's active predominantly in Rome, and you can see this same kind of intensity, but, amped up to 11. So here, for example, we have the story of the rape of the Sabines. Rape of the Sabines, long story short, Rome needed women. They didn't have women. They go to the next tribe over and they steal their women and they bring them back. Eventually the women integrate with the Roman society, produce children, and so when the Sabines come to get their women back, they make a peace and these become one tribe. So if you've ever seen the musical Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, you know all about the story of the rape of the abduction of the Sabines. But here we can see Roman soldiers lifting women off of the ground, women flailing in their arms. But notice again, it doesn't let you rest. There's a little bit of negative space here in the background, but most of it is on this dynamic action. We have guys clutching onto women, lifting them, women flailing. You have these strong diagonal movements. There's nothing calm or controlled as it would be in the Renaissance. Everything is going to be movement. That's the direction that the painting is going to go. Probably his most famous painting is going to be what's called the Triumph of Doctrine, or the glorification of the reign of Urban VIII. This is also painted in Rome in a salon for Urban VIII. And I just want to give you a context of this. There is a very shallow vault to this room, so it is a curved space, but everything you're seeing here, other than that shallow curved vault, is painted. It's all painted to fool the eye, what we call this trompe-l'oeil, this fool the eye technique, to make you think that you're seeing these huge architectural elements that extend into the sky. When we look at it, oh wow, oh my gosh, again, it doesn't give your eye a place to rest. That's the Baroque. The Baroque wants your eye to just be dazzled, to be constantly darting about, looking at everything. And so as you look up into this, the forced perspective of it is accurate to the scene. So no matter which side you look on, you are presented with a scene that just seems to go up and up and up, and you're like upskirting the gods. It's terrible. It's kind of like looking at that terrible Henry Cavill movie, The Mortals, which is beautiful but stupid, but is still, it gives you that kind of sense. Or that scene from Wonder Woman, if you've ever seen that scene in Wonder Woman where she tells the story of the gods and Mars, etc., and they show it through painting, that is directly derived from Cortona. I mean, you can't look at that scene in Wonder Woman and not imagine this is where this comes from. So here you are, you're like gazing up in the sky and these actions of all the gods. The scenes are, again, scenes borrowed mostly from classical mythology. So we have Prometheus giving fire to mortals down here. We have the Forge of Hephaestus. We have the Queen of the Gods, Juno, here. We have Athena and other characters interacting. Each of these is supported on a fictive column that has, again, telemones and atlas figures. These are supposed to be conceived of as sculptural figures that are supporting this ceiling. But none of this is real. All of this is painted. And at the very center, you have a kind of allegory. And again, this is the allegory of the glorification of the reign of Urban the Eighth, who is one of these Borromini popes. So we see angels and allegorical figures illuminated, bringing a crown of stars, and all of this is being presented to a representation of the crest of the Borromini popes. So we have the papal crown, we have the keys of St. Peter, and then here are laurels. Again, remember, laurels are things from the god Apollo that represent victory, success, excellence, and they are surrounding 3 honeybees. So, well, we're in Utah. Well, if you're at Utah Valley University or in Utah, honeybees are representations of prosperity, wealth, industry, etc. It used to be that the Borromini family crest was flies, but they thought that wasn't prestigious enough, and when they became popes and these power brokers in the papal throne, they changed it to honeybees, because honeybees were considered to be prestigious. They produce honey and hard working. So this is the crest. So all of this is an elevation of the identity of the Borromini family and the Borromini clan. Cortona also does architecture. So he also does architecture, and we see that same kind of dramatic push and pull. This is one of his better known pieces. This is Santa Maria della Pace, and again, look at this facade. The church is just this section here, but he integrates it into the courtyard. This isn't a relatively small courtyard, but he actually connects it to the side buildings, and he continues the cornices all the way around, integrating it into the space around it. Baroque is never content to just be a single object. It always has to take over. It metastasizes and grows out into the surfaces around it. It brings everything else. It wants to command your vision, because by commanding your vision, it gives you this theatrical backdrop for what's supposed to happen. So we have this porch that comes out. Columns are doubled up. And then you have a way past into the street beyond. So the church is really only this little section here, but he connects it to the street to kind of control the entire space. The bridge is attaching it to the rest of the courtyard, curve away. And this facade, oh my gosh, we have pilasters on pilasters, then it curves towards you, then more pilasters, then a pilaster, then a column, because why not? And then it breaks and then gives you this sculptural motif, and then it repeats on the other side. Again, this dramatic push and pull, wonderful kind of encompassing of all your vision, not letting the eye rest. It's all action, dynamism. It's a perfect backdrop for this idea that the church is this spiritual, mystical place. We're not going to let your eye rest. There's too much going on. You're going to have a spiritual experience, whether you like it or not. Okay, that's a good place to stop. We'll come back in this part 2, and in part 2, we'll talk about a painter that fundamentally changes painting forever. Very rarely can we point to a single painter and say, yeah, that guy revolutionized all painting, but we will do it next time when we talk about the great Caravaggio. That's all for now. We'll see you in part 2. Bye-bye.